to By Any Means Necessary on Radio Sputnik in Washington, D.C. I'm your host, Sean Blackman, here with Jackie Lukma. And as always, we are your guide for connecting the political, social, and economic movements shaping the world around us. And today on By Any Means Necessary, we'll be marking 132 years since the Wounded Knee Massacre in 1890. Also going to be touching on Western media and its portrayal of China relaxing its COVID protocols and what all that could mean. Also going to be having a look at the incoming far-right Israeli government and what that will mean for Palestinians. And as always, at 3:20 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, we'll be taking your calls. But before we can move on, Jackie, tell them what's on your mind.
Well, the U.S. government authorized over 1,500 wars, attacks, and raids on Native American people, the most of any country in the world against its indigenous people. This war waged against Native peoples of this land was done to clear the frontier for European settlers hungry for land that they were deprived of owning in their countries of origin. By the close of the so-called Indian Wars in the late 19th century, fewer than 238,000 indigenous people remained from the estimated 5 to 15 million that previously lived in North America when Columbus arrived in 1492. So much of this part of the history of this nation is intentionally ignored. Nobody wants to talk about where those tens of millions of people went, and certainly not how. President Obama signed a resolution apologizing to Native Americans in 2009. Sort of. The Native American Apology Resolution was tucked into the Defense Appropriation Act of 2010, and it read in part, quote, "The United States, acting through Congress, apologizes on behalf of the people of the United States to all Native peoples for the many instances of violence, maltreatment, and neglect inflicted on Native peoples by citizens of the United States, and expresses its regret for the ramifications of former wrongs and its commitment to build on the positive relationships of the past and present to move forward a brighter future where all the people of this land live reconciled as brothers and sisters and harmoniously steward and protect this land together," end quote. Do you notice that this is not an apology from the U.S. government or on behalf of the U.S. government for its actions, but on behalf of the people of the United States, basically absolving the government for the evils committed against Native peoples. And President Obama didn't even publicize the resolution, which was not how other leaders have conducted themselves when they've issued apologies for their countries to their indigenous populations. No, he just quietly stuck this in the Defense Appropriations Bill of all insulting places, among the funding for the very apparatus, the U.S. military, that was the tip of the spear of Indian genocide in this country. And the final insult? Just like with the so-called apologies to African Americans for slavery issued by the House of Representatives in 2008 and the Senate in 2009, the Obama administration's resolution apologizing for violence against Native Americans includes a disclaimer that says that nothing in it authorizes or supports any legal claims against the United States, and the resolution does not settle any claims. It would have been fitting, at the very least, to name some of the massacres committed against Native people in the 2009 resolution, even though they all could not possibly be listed. This could have been done to express a true acknowledgement of the atrocities committed, the Nadutan Massacre, the Battle of Tippecanoe, the forced removal and the Trail of Tears, the Mankato executions, the Sand Creek Massacre, the California massacres, for which Governor Gavin Newsom actually did issue a public apology, recognizing it as a genocide. And the Wounded Knee Massacre could easily have been named, if not for any other reason than to honor the lives that were taken in them. Wounded Knee is where on this day, December 29th in 1890, a Lakota encampment on the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation was attacked by the U.S. Army, and close to 300 Native Americans were murdered near Wounded Knee Creek in South Dakota. But to name these crimes against humanity would be to defy the narrative of Indians as savages. That's been the excuse that has been crafted to justify their extermination for so long. In the 2007 HBO docudrama Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee, Chief Sitting Bull complains to a U.S. Army colonel about whites' violent treatment of Indians. And the colonel retorts, "You were killing each other for hundreds of moons before the first white stepped foot on this continent." Intertribal disputes do not register anywhere near the scale and magnitude of the utter evisceration of an entire people that European-descended settlers and the government they created in this country committed. This is like comparing a fistfight between cousins to World War II, but this excuse lives on in its despicable ignorance. And the U.S. rewards its foot soldiers of genocide. Because after the massacre at Wounded Knee, 20 U.S. cavalry soldiers were given the Medal of Honor for killing innocent Lakota men, women, and children. There has recently been an effort in Congress to rescind the medals from these murderers. While still a member of Congress, then Representative Deb Haaland, Democrat of New Mexico, introduced the Remove the Stain Act. She said that the act was, quote, about more than just rescinding medals of honor from soldiers who served in the U.S. 7th Cavalry and massacred unnamed Lakota women and children in 1890. It's also about making people aware of this country's history of genocide of American Indians. It's hoped that the bill will pass this year, but those hopes are tempered with the reality that this nation's government is still in the business of supporting and carrying out unjust warmongering. By the way, Pine Ridge was also where, beginning on February 27, 1973, 83 years after the Wounded Knee massacre, that a 71-day standoff between the Oglala Sioux of the Pine Ridge Reservation and the American Indian movement and federal law enforcement officials occurred. After years of violent crimes went unsolved on the Pine Ridge Reservation, the Oglala Lakota people were fed up with the inaction and corruption of tribal chairman Dick Wilson and tribal police who many believed were supported and in cahoots with the FBI in much of the violence. After an unsuccessful attempt to impeach Wilson, the Oglala Lakota called the American Indian movement for help. When AIM arrived and occupied the town in an attempt to bring order, federal law enforcement surrounded Pine Ridge and tried to force members of AIM out with heavy fire. And just like the U.S. government did with Indigenous Peoples decades before, they cut off water, food, and supplies to the reservation until the people surrendered. But with all acts of repression, resistance blooms in its midst. Whether it's been the ghost dance movement outlined by the federal government in the 1890s, the American Indian movement in the 1970s, or the current land back, missing and murdered Indigenous women and environmental movements among Indigenous people today, this history of repression of Indigenous people will never die as long as Indigenous people continue to resist their erasure. And if we finally listen to what the original people have to say, that just might be where the salvation of this nation lies. But until we do right by them, nothing good is going to come to this country. Follow Lukman Nation on patreon.com/Lukman Nation for lots of great content.
Those are today's talking points, and you are listening to By Any Means Necessary on Radio Sputnik in Washington, D.C. I'm your host, Sean Blackman, here with Jackie Lukman, and as always, we're your guide for connecting the political, social, and economic movement shaping the world around us.
By any means necessary.